Alrighty. Hello, my friends, young and old, and anywhere in between, and good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, or anywhere in between. Good to see you. Nice to be here. It is 7 o'clock. Well, just turned 7:01 in California, and I am here to read. I'm here to chew bubblegum and read, and I'm all out of bubblegum. Anyway, good to see you. Thank you for joining me. As mentioned at great length last night, we had a celebration of life for my parents this weekend. I won't go into details again because I did a lot of talking about it on the middle of the night broadcast, the 1 a.m. broadcast. But if you are interested and you haven't seen it, you can go check in with that. It's nothing, there's nothing surprising. There are no denunciations of my oppressive patriarchal family because they weren't that. And in fact, one of the best parts, the nicest things about the weekend was just all the other people's response, the kindness and the support and love. And a lot of people recognizing how fortunate my brothers and I were to have those particular people as our parents. So if you're interested, as I said, where I talk about it a little more and get off on some other topics too, go please check the previous episode, I guess, for lack of a better term. At the moment, I am putting episode numbers on the readings, and that would make that particular episode Wind in the Willows number 3, and this is Wind in the Willows number 4, because that is indeed what we are reading, The Adventures of Ratty, Mole, Mr. Toad, and various others. And I will get to that in just a moment. Let me first kind of think through here if there was anything else that I wanted to share with you guys. The only thing I did of any usefulness whatsoever today was signed another 500 or whatever tip-in sheets. So as I mentioned, my British publishers, Hodder, are putting out some specialty volumes of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and Dragonbone Chair and Stone of Farewell are the two that I have signed what are called tip-ins for. As I've mentioned before, tip-ins are simply separate pieces of paper, title pages, that get signed and then get tipped in later so that they don't have to be signed in the book. You can sign them separately. It makes it a lot less clumsy, I will absolutely say. It's a lot less difficult to deal with just piles of paper instead of actual books that have to be signed. I've done that in bulk too. That's a different operation entirely. So anyway, though that one's finished, I still have to do the Green Angel Tower ones, but I think I'm going to take a day or two off and let my signing muscles recover, my wrist tendons. What else? Deb and I are just doing the stuff. We're doing the stuff that has to be done. We're working on various things. We're working on, Deb's mostly doing fabric art, which is what she's been doing lately. But of course, she's also doing, as usual, a ton of stuff for... Oh, please, God, forgive me for saying this. The brand, namely the books, both mine and hers and mine together, which is a lot of stuff because, as you move through the business over the years, you've got tons of contracts and all kinds of complicated bits and pieces to be dealt with. So we're doing her work and also, of course, obviously her fabric stuff that she's doing too. And if you're interested in that, you can check that out either on Deb's Facebook page or on the artist formerly known as Twitter page, although that's just my name for it. It's got another name now, but I'm so irritated by the whole process of how it's being run, I'm not going to say it. But anyway, if you're interested in seeing some of Deb's stuff, that's a good place to check it out. And what else? And I'm working on The Splintered Sun. I am in the early stages and leaving aside the other things that have complicated things this week, this month. It has also, it's the very early stages and I'm still making a lot of decisions on how to proceed in terms of tone and specifically how the narration or how the narrative is being shaped, and whether I'm going to do stuff that's similar to my other Ostenard books in terms of how I tell the stories. I'm hoping these books will be a little bit shorter than the main Ostenard books. So there are different questions involved in how to tell stories. So I'm working with those and picking away at them. And of course, the other thing is, even though this is theoretically, ostensibly, one of my favorite words, even though this is ostensibly an Ostenard book, I mean, in the sense it obviously is an Ostenard book and takes place, a couple hundred years or so before the Dragonbone Chair, still, because most of it takes place in a particular part that we haven't seen as much of, especially in the earlier books, namely Hernistir, I am spending a lot of time world building, essentially, something that I haven't had to world build before. What was Hernistir like 200 years ago or more before the Dragonbone Chair in the time of King Tethtain, who is mentioned in the Dragonbone Chair as the Hernistiri king who wound up in the Hayholt. So, the first thing is I have to work out the rest of the story of how that came to be and what the general political and economic engines of the Hernistiri kingdom at that time were, and all kinds of stuff like that. So there's a combination of things that are contributing also to the slow beginning. It's like a 7. Well, this one isn't big enough to be like a 747. That's more in the Navigator's Children kind of category, or Two Green Angel Tower. But it's definitely like a 737 or a 707, to throw out some plain numbers. In the sense that you have to get going fast enough that it develops its own lift. And this is as true for books as it is for passenger airplanes. You cannot simply start and feel like you feel when you're like halfway through. It doesn't work that way. You have to get a feeling for not just what you're writing, who you're writing about, what the whole feel of everything is, and as I mentioned earlier, literally how, in a technical sense, you are telling the story. So at these early stages, it's all kind of stuff where you might write a paragraph or a page or 5 pages or whatever and say, I don't like the feel of that. It doesn't feel intimate enough, or it doesn't feel dramatic enough, or whatever the case might be. So that's another thing to be worked on. And it's one of the things that I don't think gets talked about a lot by writers, talking to beginning writers or to wannabe writers or whatever, is that there are these other concerns as well. It's not a simple thing. You don't just simply go, okay, I'm going to tell a story. Well, some artists may be able to. I don't know any. But for most of us, it's a question of really interrogating yourself, interrogating the story, trying to decide what is important and what will best convey that. And that's not just by any means plot or a character. You can have iron-bound, excellent plots, and you can have really good characters. But if you don't figure out how you are going to put those things together to tell the story, and you have an awkward combination of those things, or you make it just difficult to read, or more difficult than it should be to read, you are not going to have a successful book, even if your plot's great and your characters are great. This is, of course, beyond the first level of like being able to spell and use the English language, which obviously those things are at least somewhat important. Not the spelling quite as much these days, but the using the language and all that. And for anybody out there who happens to be interested in becoming a writer, the first thing that I can tell you about virtually every writer, and certainly every good writer that I have ever met, is you've got to read. You've got to read. You've got to read widely. You've got to read voraciously. You have to have enough stuff that has soaked into you about storytelling and about using the language to convey your meaning to other people and to manipulate, in a sense, to manipulate the audience, because that's what we're doing. That's what the audience expects. They do not want everything to happen just the way they're expecting it to. At least most readers don't. They want to be surprised. They want to be caught off balance occasionally. It's fine if once in a while they guess what you're doing, but if they guess what you're doing every single time, that is not going to work. That is not going to be a book that people are going to remember the rest of their lives or even for 5 minutes after they finish it. So these are all things to consider, and they're all things that I'm in the active wrestling stage. When I started The Witchwood Crown 10 years ago, whenever it was, when I started The Witchwood Crown, I already knew I was going to be working with the same kind of format for that book as I did for the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books. I knew that I wanted it to feel as though it was a continuation of those books rather than a dramatic change. And but as you will note, if you've read them, that the shorter books, one of them takes that, what I'll call, for lack of a better term, my usual Ostenard approach. That is the Heart of What Was Lost, where you have, in this case, I think it was two main characters, and you're kind of going back and forth between them. Three main characters, right, of course, yeah, because there's Porto, there's Isgrimner, and there is Vieki. And in that sense, I was doing basically what I was doing in the Ostenard books, just at a smaller scale, and a more bijou scale. Whereas the Brothers of the Wind, which was also an Ostenard book because of its setting and its very, very tangled connection with the history and lore of Ostenard, it's definitely an Ostenard book, but it's told by somebody in their first person voice. It's like a diary. It's a narrative by a single narrator and carries all that goes with that. So because I'm writing another Ostenard book, I don't necessarily need to follow that first pattern of the same as all the other books. And so rather than just jump right in and kind of fall back into that, following every individual character kind of thing, I'm thinking about it. I'm working with it. I'm trying to see what will be the best way to throw that all together. Okay, before we start the reading, which is actually what I am here to do, I am going to check in and see if anybody has shown up and put their names on here so I can say hello to them. And so let's see. I see I've got Sean. Hello, Sean. There's my buddy Sean. Isaac. Hello, Isaac. Good to see you. Emily. A pleasure as always. Ivan, my long-lost superstar buddy. Kelly. Hello, Kelly. Winter. Hello, Winter. Good to see you too. Tim. A pleasure, Tim. Nice to have you with me again. Claudia. Hello. James. Good to see you too. Tracy. And Angie. And Mark and Susan. All dear and beloved folks and friends. So anyway, and Isaac is suggesting that I write it as an epic poem in Florentine cantos. Tell you what, Isaac, I'll send you the rough text, and you can put it into cantos for me. It's been a long time since I've read the Inferno, so I'm not sure how good my cantos are. I suppose it would depend on which translation. Oh, and there's Boris. Hello, Boris. I didn't see your name on there earlier, but good to see you, and thank you for joining us. Also, John White, who was not on the first list, but is on them now. And so hello to you too, sir. Good to see you. Okay, so what I am going to do now, first I'm going to have a drink. It's water. I know I sounded like I really needed that, but it was purely for dry throat. All right, so we have reached chapter 5 of The Wind and the Willows. And as I have said several times, this was a book I chose not only because, I am in the middle of this sort of nostalgic thing after having spent several weeks going through old family photos and all kinds of things and thinking about my parents. And this was a book my mom read to me and when I was quite young. And it's also a book that has stuck with me through my life, including up to the time where I became a writer. And I'm sure many of you have noticed during the first 4 chapters, if you're paying attention, how very attuned this particular narrative is to not just animals, because of course it is talking about the animals, but they are essentially human-like characters. but also talking at great detail and with quite a bit of insight about the living world in which this takes place. Now, yes, of course, a living world in which toads drive motor cars and rats have little houses with boats tied up in front and all that stuff. Not strictly real life, but the love, Kenneth Grahame's love of the natural world, at least of the English natural world around him, it comes through very clearly in these books. And it was one of the things I think that made me ready for Tolkien a few years later when I was old enough to read on my own and my mom gave me Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings is also extremely tied into a love for, a respect for the natural environment. And in fact, I think one of the things that probably puts some readers off of The Lord of the Rings and maybe off of Wind in the Willows also is the fact that descriptions of nature are such an important part of it. And as you may know, if you've ever seen the Disney version, which I think was half of a Disney animated film, I think it was called Ichabod and Mr. Toad or something like that. And they did The Headless Horseman and they did Toad's Adventures. And pretty much left Ratty and Mole out of the whole thing, as I recall, but it's been a long time. But obviously, one of the things that largely disappeared from the Disney adaptation was anything to do with the natural world. But that is a key part of how these books work and what I think was sort of bubbling up inside of Grahame when he was writing the books. Anyway, I'll do some research on Grahame before I read next week, and I can tell you a little bit more about that kind of stuff. But anyway, so let me bring you up to date. So, we've already seen Mr. Toad fall in love with automobiles after one drove his wagon off the road and smashed it. And Mr. Toad and his famous fascinations and crotchets and weird fads and frenzies. But of course, the two central characters in this actual book are Mole, who's kind of the protagonist. He is the uncarved block, as it were, who has to go out in the world to learn about the world. And Rat, his friend, who is much more knowledgeable about the natural world around them because he has been living outside on the river, whereas Mole, and we will find out more about that in this chapter, has been underground, living in a tunnel, living in a burrow for most of his life. So, after almost getting eaten by foxes and weasels in the wild wood, Toad and Rat made their way through the snow to Mr. Badger, spent a very soothing, relaxing, and reassuring time with him, and have now returned home. And in this case, and here this is critical for this chapter, home for Mole, temporarily anyway, is Rat's house. He's living with Rat in Rat's house just above the river. So, chapter 5, Dulce Domum, and I'm probably mispronouncing the Latin because unlike my wife in the English school system, I never actually got taught Latin. So, it's either Dulce Domum or Dulce Domum. I'm not sure which, but it basically means home, sweet home. Chapter 5. The sheep ran huddling together against the hurdles, blowing out thin nostrils and stamping with delicate forefeet, their heads thrown back and a light steam rising from the crowded sheep pen into the frosty air, as the two animals hastened by in high spirits with much chatter and laughter. They were returning across country after a long day's outing with Otter, hunting and exploring on the wide uplands where certain streams tributary to their own river had their first small beginnings, and the shades of the short winter day were closing in on them, and they had still some distance to go. Plodding at random across the plough, they had heard the sheep and had made for them, and now, leading from the sheep pen, they found a beaten track that made walking a lighter business, and responded, moreover, to that small, inquiring something which all animals carry inside them, saying, unmistakably, "Yes, quite right, this leads home." "It looks as if we're coming to a village," said the mole somewhat dubiously, slackening his pace, as the track, that had in time become a path and then had developed into a lane, now handed them over to the charge of a well-metalled road, and that basically has to do with how the surface has been pressed down flat. The animals did not hold with villages, and their own highways, thickly frequented as they were, took an independent course, regardless of church, post office, or public house. "Oh, never mind," said the rat. "At this season of the year they're all safe indoors by this time, sitting round the fire. Men, women, and children, dogs and cats and all. We shall slip through all right, without any bother or unpleasantness. And we can have a look at them through their windows, if you like, and see what they're doing." The rapid nightfall of mid-December had quite beset the little village as they approached it on soft feet over a thin fall of powdery snow. Little was visible but squares of dusky orange-red on either side of the street, where the firelight or lamplight of each cottage overflowed through the casements into the dark world without. Most of the low, latticed windows were innocent of blinds, and to the lookers in from outside, the inmates, gathered round the tea-table, absorbed in handiwork or talking with laughter and gesture, had each that happy grace which is the last thing the skilled actor shall capture, the natural grace which goes with perfect unconsciousness of observation. Moving at will from one theater to another, the two spectators, so far from home themselves, had something of wistfulness in their eyes as they watched a cat being stroked, a sleepy child picked up and huddled off to bed, or a tired man stretch and knock out his pipe on the end of a smoldering log. But it was from one little window with its blind drawn down, a mere blank transparency on the night, that the sense of home and the little curtained world within walls, the larger, stressful world of outside nature shut out and forgotten, most pulsated. Close against the white blind hung a birdcage, clearly silhouetted, every wire, perch, and appurtenance distinct and recognizable, even to yesterday's dull-edged lump of sugar. On the middle perch the fluffy occupant, head tucked well into feathers, seemed so near to them as to be easily stroked, had they tried. Even the delicate tips of his plumped-out plumage penciled plainly on the illuminated screen. And here, whoops, let me get that, because everything's backwards. It always takes a while to get this picture up. So there are rat and mole, and they are staring up at the window, at the cage of the parrot within. And it's a little hard to tell from that picture, but the blind is supposed to be drawn. And there are rat and mole standing in the snow looking up. One has to think in this world, if somebody walked out and saw a rat and a mole standing in front of their house, dressed in coats and galoshes and all that stuff, would it seem strange or not? That's a question that is kind of answered later on, because as we do see and will see, there is more interaction between the animals and the real world later on. Anyway, as they looked, the sleepy little fellow, this is the bird, stirred uneasily, woke, shook himself, and raised his head. They could see the gape of his tiny beak as he yawned in a bored sort of way, looked round, and then settled his head into his back again, while the ruffled feathers gradually subsided into perfect stillness. Then a gust of bitter wind took them in the back of the neck. A small sting of frozen sleet on the skin woke them, as from a dream, and they knew their toes to be cold and their legs tired and their own home distant, a weary way. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly on either side of the road, they could smell through the darkness the friendly fields again, and they braced themselves for the last long stretch, the home stretch, the stretch that we know is bound to end sometime in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, and the sight of familiar things greeting us as long-absent travelers from far oversea. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. The moles ran a good deal on supper, as it was pitch dark, and it was all a strange country to him as far as he knew, and he was following obediently in the wake of the rat, leaving the guidance entirely to him. As for the rat, he was walking a little way ahead, as his habit was, his shoulders humped, his eyes fixed on the straight gray road in front of him. So he did not notice poor Mole when suddenly the summons reached him and took him like an electric shock. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not even proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications with his surroundings, living or otherwise, and have only the word smell, for instance, to include the whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of the animal night and day, summoning, warning, inciting, repelling. It was one of these mysterious fairy calls from out of the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal, even while as yet he could not clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in its efforts to recapture the fine filament, the telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment, and he had caught it again, and with it this time came recollection in fullest flood. And here's a picture of Mole. Let me see if I've got this. It's hard to see from where I am. Okay, there we go. Mole getting that telegraphic feeling that something important was right close by. And one of the things I want to point out about Ernest Shepard's brilliant illustrations here, let me see if I can get it to focus on it. Yes, there, is you can see that although Mole is wearing an overcoat, apparently, and perhaps even little gloves, I can't tell, but that is actually a very accurate representation of a certain kind of mole. It is not a cutesy Disney-fied mole. Ernest Shepard was a fascinating artist, one of my very favorites of all time. And if you looked at that mole and you didn't know that that was the protagonist of your story, you'd kind of go, ooh, he looks a little creepy. But he looks like a mole is what he looks like. And that is one of the things that I love about these particular illustrations for this book. House at Pooh Corner, a lot of Shepard's other illustrations were more, let me see if I can get this to focus again. Many of Shepard's other illustrations were for more specifically, what's the word I'm looking for? Childlike kinds of interpretations of the world. But for some reason, although obviously when you look at the pictures of Mole and others, Toad and others, there's a great deal of fanciful action in Wind in the Willows, but Shepard also at the same time strives, and succeeds to make his animals look like the actual animals, despite the fact that they're dressed up and eating bacon and things like that. Anyway, a moment, and he had caught it again, and with it this time came recollection in fullest flood. Home. That was what they meant, those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at that moment, his old home that he had hurriedly forsaken and never sought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on that bright morning, he had hardly given it a thought. So absorbed had he been in his new life, in all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh and captivating experiences. Now, with a rush of old memories, how clearly it stood up before him in the darkness. Shabby, indeed, and small and poorly furnished, and yet his, the home he had made for himself, the home he had been so happy to get back to after his day's work. And the home had been happy with him, too, evidently, and was missing him and wanted him back, and was telling him so through his nose, sorrowfully, reproachfully, but with no bitterness or anger, only with plaintive reminder that it was there and wanted him. The call was clear. The summons was plain. He must obey it instantly. Sorry, this lack of focus is still bugging me. Hi, everybody. There we go. Yay! Weird focus on this camera. The call was clear. The summons was plain. He must obey it instantly and go. "Ratty!" he called, full of joyful excitement. "Hold on! Come back! I want you quick!" "Oh, come on, Mole! Come along, do!" replied the rat cheerfully, still plodding along. "Please stop, Ratty!" pleaded the poor mole in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. I've just come across the smell of it, and it's close by here, really quite close. And I must go to it. I must. Oh, come back, Ratty, please, please come back." The rat was by this time very far ahead, too far to hear clearly what Mole was calling, too far to catch the sharp note of painful appeal in his voice. And he was much taken up with the weather, for he too could smell something suspiciously like approaching snow. "Mole, we mustn't stop now, really," he called back. "We'll come for it tomorrow, whatever it is you've found. But I daren't stop now. It's late, and the snow's coming on again, and I'm not sure of the way. And I want your nose, Mole, so come on quick, there's a good fellow." And the rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole stood alone in the road, his heart torn asunder, and a big sob gathering somewhere low down inside him, to leap up to the surface presently, he knew, in passionate escape. But even under such a test as that, his loyalty to his friend stood firm. Never for a moment did he dream of abandoning him. Meanwhile, the wafts from his old home pleaded, whispered, conjured, and finally claimed him imperiously. He dared not tarry very long within their magic circle. With a wrench that tore his very heartstrings, he set his face down the road and followed submissively in the track of the rat, while faint, thin little smells, still dogging his retreating nose, reproached him for his new friendship and his callous forgetfulness. With an effort he caught up the unsuspecting rat, who began chattering cheerfully about what they would do when they got back, and how jolly a fire of logs in the parlor would be, and what a supper he meant to eat, never noticing his companion's silence and distressful state of mind. At last, however, when they had gone some considerable way further, and were passing some tree stumps at the edge of a copse that bordered the road, he stopped and said kindly, "Look here, Mole, old chap, you seem dead tired. No talk left in you, and your feet dragging like lead. We'll sit down here for a minute and rest. The snow has held off so far, and the best part of our journey is over." The mole subsided forlornly on a tree stump, and tried to control himself, for he felt it surely coming. The sob he had fought with so long refused to be beaten. Up and up it forced its way to the air, and then another, and another, and others thick and fast, till poor Mole at last gave up the struggle and cried, freely and helplessly and openly, now that he knew it was all over and he had lost what he could hardly be said to have found. The rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mole's paroxysm of grief, did not dare to speak for a while. At last he said, very quietly and sympathetically, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter? Tell us your trouble, and let me see what I can do." Poor Mole found it difficult to get any words out between the upheavals of his chest that followed one upon another so quickly, and held back speech and choked it as it came. I know it's a shabby, dingy little place," he sobbed forth at last brokenly. "Not like your cozy quarters or Toad's beautiful hall. Badger's great house, but it was my own little home, and I was fond of it. And I went away, and I forgot all about it. And then I smelt it suddenly on the road when I called you, and you wouldn't listen, Rat. And everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it. Oh, dear, oh, dear. And when you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, and I had to leave it, though I was smelling it all the time, I thought my heart would break. We might have just gone and had one look at it, Ratty, only one look. It was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, you wouldn't turn back. Oh, dear, oh, dear. Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow, and sobs again took full charge of him, preventing further speech. The rat stared straight in front of him, saying nothing, only patting Mole gently on the shoulder. After a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been. A pig. That's me. Just a pig, a plain pig." He waited till Mole's sobs became gradually less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited till at last sniffs were frequent and sobs only intermittent. Then he rose from his seat and, remarking carelessly, "Well, now we'd really better be getting on, old chap," set off up the road again, over the toilsome way they had come. Wherever are you going to, Ratty?" cried the tearful Mole, looking up in alarm. "We're going to find that home of yours, old fellow," replied the rat pleasantly. "So you had better come along, for it will take some finding, and we shall want your nose." "Oh, come back, Ratty, do," cried the Mole, getting up and hurrying after him. "It's no good, I tell you. It's too late and too dark, and the place is too far off, and the snow's coming. And I never meant to let you know I was feeling that way about it. It was all an accident and a mistake. And think of Riverbank, and your supper." "Hang Riverbank, and hang supper too," said the rat heartily. "I tell you I'm going to find this place now if I stay out all night. So cheer up, old chap, and take my arm, and we'll very soon be back there again." Still snuffling, pleading, and reluctant, Mole suffered himself to be dragged back along the road by his imperious companion, who, by a flow of cheerful talk and anecdote, endeavored to beguile his spirits back and make the weary way seem shorter. When at last it seemed to the rat that they must be nearing that part of the road where the Mole had been held up, he said, "Now, no more talking. Business. Use your nose and give your mind to it." They moved on in silence for some little way, when suddenly the rat was conscious, through his arm that was linked in Mole's, of a faint sort of electric thrill that was passing down that animal's body. Instantly he disengaged himself, fell back a pace, and waited, all attention. The signals were coming through. Mole stood a moment, rigid, while his uplifted nose, quivering slightly, felt the air. Then a short, quick run forward, a fault, a check, a try back, and then a slow, steady, confident advance. The rat, much excited, kept close to his heels as the Mole, with something of the air of a sleepwalker, crossed a dry ditch, scrambled through a hedge, and nosed his way over a field open and trackless and bare in the faint starlight. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, but the rat was on the alert and promptly followed him down the tunnel to which his unerring nose had faithfully led him. It was close and airless, and the earthy smell was strong, and it seemed a long time to Rat ere the passage ended and he could stand erect and stretch and shake himself. The Mole struck a match, and by its light the rat saw that they were standing in an open space, neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was Mole's little front door, with Mole End painted in Gothic lettering over the bell pull at the side. And here we see them. Whoops. Let me remember how to do this properly. You need to bend that more. Take it that way. Stop. Where did you go? There you are. Okay. So, and give it a moment to find the focus. And there they are. It doesn't want to focus. Come on. Let's focus. Why is it being so difficult? Anyway, you can't really see it very well, but that's Rat and Mole standing in the middle of the entry garden, I guess you'd call it, to Mole's house. And for some reason, it doesn't want to focus on that now. It only wants to focus on what it wants to focus on. Mole reached down a lantern from a nail on the wall and lit it. And the rat, looking around, saw that they were in a sort of forecourt. A garden seat stood on one side of the door, and on the other a roller. For the mole, who was a tidy animal when at home, could not stand having his ground kicked up by other animals into little runs that ended in earth heaps. On the walls hung wire baskets with ferns in them, alternating with brackets carrying plaster statuary. Garibaldi, and the infant Samuel, and Queen Victoria, and other heroes of modern Italy. Down one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley, with benches along it and little wooden tables marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. In the middle was a small round pond containing goldfish and surrounded by a cockleshell border. Out of the center of the pond rose a fanciful erection clothed in more cockleshells and topped by a large silvered glass ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. Mole's face beamed at the sight of all these objects so dear to him, and he hurried Rat through the door, lit a lamp in the hall, and took one glance round his old home. He saw the dust lying thick on everything, saw the cheerless, deserted look of the long-neglected house, and its narrow, meager dimensions, its worn and shabby contents, and collapsed again on a hall chair, his nose in his paws. "Oh, Ratty!" he cried dismally. "Why ever did I do it? Why did I bring you to this poor, cold little place on a night like this, when you might have been at Riverbank by this time, toasting your toes before a blazing fire with all your own nice things about you?" The rat paid no heed to his doleful self-reproaches. He was running here and there, opening doors, inspecting rooms and cupboards, and lighting lamps and candles, and sticking them up everywhere. "What a capital little house this is!" he called out cheerily. "So compact, so well planned. Everything here and everything in its place. We'll make a jolly night of it. The first thing we want is a good fire. I'll see to that. I always know where to find things. So this is the parlor? Splendid. Your own idea? Those little sleeping bunks in the wall? Capital. Now, I'll fetch the wood and the coals, and you get a duster, Mole. You'll find one in the drawer of the kitchen table. Try and smarten things up a bit. Bustle about, old chap." Encouraged by his inspiriting companion, the mole roused himself and dusted and polished with energy and heartiness, while the rat, running to and fro with armfuls of fuel, soon had a cheerful blaze roaring up the chimney. He hailed the mole to come and warm himself, but Mole promptly had another fit of the blues, dropping down on a couch in dark despair and burying his face in his duster. "Rat," he moaned, "how about your supper? You poor, cold, hungry, weary animal. I've nothing to give you, nothing, not a crumb." "What a fellow you are for giving in," said the rat reproachfully. "Why, only just now I saw a sardine opener on the kitchen dresser, quite distinctly. And everybody knows that means there are sardines about somewhere in the neighborhood. Rouse yourself, pull yourself together, and come with me and forage." They went and foraged accordingly, hunting through every cupboard and turning out every drawer. The result was not so very depressing after all, though of course it might have been better. A tin of sardines, a box of Captain's biscuits nearly full, and a German sausage encased in silver paper. "There's a banquet for you," observed the rat as he arranged the table. "I know some animals who would give their ears to be sitting down to supper with us tonight." "No bread," groaned the mole dolorously. "No butter, no Pt.4, no champagne," continued the rat, grinning. "And that reminds me, what's that little door at the end of the passage?" "Your cellar, of course. Every luxury in this house. Just you wait a minute." He made for the cellar door, and presently reappeared, somewhat dusty, with a bottle of beer in each paw and another under each arm. "Self-indulgent beggar you seem to be, Mole," he observed. "Deny yourself nothing. This is really the jolliest little place I ever was in. Now, wherever did you pick up those prints? Make the place so home-like, they do. No wonder you're so fond of it, Mole. Tell us all about it, and how you came to make it what it is." Then, while the rat busied himself fetching plates and knives and forks and mustard, which he mixed in an egg cup, the mole, his bosom still heaving with the stress of his recent emotion, related, somewhat shyly at first, but with more freedom as he warmed to his subject, how this was planned, and how that was thought out, and how this was got through a windfall from an aunt, and that was a wonderful find and a bargain, and this other thing was bought out of laborious savings and a certain amount of going without. His spirits finally quite restored, he must needs go and caress his possessions, and take a lamp and show off their points to his visitor, and expatiate on them, quite forgetful of the supper they both so much needed. Rat, who was desperately hungry, but strove to conceal it, nodding seriously, examining with a puckered brow, and saying, "Wonderful," and "most remarkable," at intervals when the chance for an observation was given him. At last the rat succeeded in decoying him to the table, and had just got seriously to work with the sardine opener when sounds were heard from the forecourt without. Sounds like the scuffling of small feet in the gravel, and a confused murmur of tiny voices, while broken sentences reached them. "Now, all in line. Hold the lantern up a bit, Tommy. Clear your throats first. No coughing after I say 1, 2, 3. Where's young Bill? Here, come on, do. We're all a-waiting." "What's up?" inquired the rat, pausing in his labors. I think it must be the field mice," replied the mole with a touch of pride in his manner. "They go round carol singing regularly at this time of the year. They're quite an institution in these parts, and they never pass me over. They come to Mole End last of all. And I used to give them hot drinks and supper, too, sometimes, when I could afford it. It will be like old times to hear them again." "Let's have a look at them," cried the rat, jumping up and running to the door. It was a pretty sight, and a seasonable one, that met their eyes when they flung the door open. In the forecourt, lit by the dim rays of a horn lantern, some 8 or 10 little field mice stood in a semicircle, red worsted comforters round their throats, their forepaws thrust deep into their pockets, their feet jigging for warmth. And here, see if we can get it to focus this time. And here are the field mice standing. There's Mole, of course, holding up a candle, and there are the field mice standing in the doorway, ready to sing some Christmas carols. There we go, we're in focus there. With bright, beady eyes, they glanced shyly at each other, sniggering a little, sniffing and applying coat sleeves a good deal. As the door opened, one of the elder ones that carried the lantern was just saying, "Now then, 1, 2, 3, and forthwith their shrill little voices uprose on the air, singing one of the old-time carols that their forefathers composed in fields that were fallow and held by frost, or when snow-bound in chimney corners, and handed down to be sung in the miry streets to lamp-lit windows at Yuletide. "Villagers all this frosty tide, let your doors swing open wide. The wind may follow and snow beside, yet draw us in by your fire to bide. Joy shall be yours in the morning." Excuse me. Here we stand in the cold and the sleet, blowing fingers and stamping feet. Come from far away you to greet, you by the fire and we in the street, bidding you joy in the morning. For ere one half of the night was gone, suddenly a star has led us on, raining bliss and benison, bliss tomorrow and more anon, joy for every morning. Goodman Joseph toiled through the snow, saw the star o'er a stable low. Mary, she might not further go. Welcome thatch and litter below, joy was hers in the morning. Those are not Christmas carolers at the door. That's probably a pizza delivery, and you can hear Johnny barking back there. And then they heard the angels tell, who were the first to cry Noel? Animals all, as it befell, in the stable where they did dwell. Joy shall be theirs in the morning. The voices ceased, the singers bashful but smiling, exchanging sidelong glances, and silence succeeded, but for a moment only. Then from up and above, and far away down the tunnel they had so lately traveled, was borne to their ears in a faint musical hum the sound of distant bells ringing a joyful and clangorous peal. "Very well sung, boys," cried the rat heartily. "And now come in, all of you. Come on, and warm yourselves by the fire and have something hot." "Yes, come along, field mice," cried the mole eagerly. "This is quite..." Excuse me. "Yes, come along, field mice," cried the mole eagerly. "This is quite like old times. Shut the door after you. Pull up that settle to the fire. Now you just wait a minute while we... Oh, Ratty!" he cried in despair, plumping down on a seat, with tears impending. "Whatever are we doing? We've nothing to give them." "You leave all that to me," said the masterful rat. "Here, you with the lantern. Come over this way. I want to talk to you. Now, tell me, are there any shops open at this hour of the night?"
"Why, certainly, sir,"
replied the field mouse respectfully.
"At this time of the year our shops keep open to all sorts of hours."
"Then look here," said the rat. "You go off at once, and you and your lantern, and you get me..." Here much muttered conversation ensued, and the mole only heard bits of it, such as, "Fresh, mind you. No, a pound of that will do. See, you get Buggins, for I won't have any other. No, only the best. If you can't get it there, try somewhere else. Yes, of course, homemade, no tinned stuff. Well, then, do the best you can." Finally, there was a chink of coin passing from paw to paw. The field mouse was provided with an ample basket for his purchases, and off he hurried, he and his lantern. The rest of the field mice, perched in a row on the settle, their small legs swinging, gave themselves up to enjoyment of the fire, and toasted their chilblains till they tingled, while the mole, failing to draw them into easy conversation, plunged into a family history, and made each of them recite the names of his numerous brothers, who were too young, it appeared, to be allowed to go out a-caroling this year, but looked forward very shortly to winning the parental consent. The rat, meanwhile, was busy examining the label on one of the beer bottles. "I perceive this to be Old Burton," he remarked approvingly. "Sensible mole, the very thing. Now we shall be able to mull some ale. Get the things ready, mole, while I draw the corks." It did not take long to prepare the brew, and thrust the tin heater well into the red heart of the fire, and soon every field mouse was sipping and coughing and choking, for a little mulled ale goes a long way, and wiping his eyes and laughing and forgetting he had ever been cold in his life.
They act plays, too, these fellows,"
the mole explained to the rat.
"Make them up all by themselves and act them afterwards. And very well they do it, too. They gave us a capital one last year about a field mouse who was captured at sea by a Barbary corsair and made to row in a galley. and when he escaped and got home again, his lady love had gone into a convent. Here, you were in it, I remember. Get up and recite a bit.
The field mouse addressed got up on his legs, giggled shyly, looked around the room, and remained absolutely tongue-tied. His comrades cheered him on. Mole coaxed and encouraged him, and the rat went so far as to take him by the shoulders and shake him, but nothing could overcome his stage fright. They were all busily engaged on him like watermen applying the Royal Humane Society's regulations to a case of long submersion, when the latch clicked, the door opened, and the field mouse with the lantern reappeared, staggering under the weight of his basket. There was no more talk of play acting once the very real and solid contents of the basket had been tumbled out on the table. Under the generalship of Rat, everybody was set to do something or to fetch something. In a very few minutes supper was ready, and Mole, as he took the head of the table in a sort of dream, saw a lately barren board set thick with savory comforts, saw his little friends' faces brighten and beam as they fell to without delay, and then let himself loose, for he was famished indeed, on the provender so magically provided, thinking what a happy homecoming this had turned out after all. As they ate, they talked of old times, and the field mice gave him the local gossip up to date, and answered as well as they could the 100 questions he had to ask them. The rat said little or nothing, only taking care that each guest had what he wanted and plenty of it, and that Mole had no trouble or anxiety about anything. They clattered off at last, very grateful, and showering wishes of the season with their jacket pockets stuffed with remembrances for the small brothers and sisters at home. When the door had closed on the last of them, and the chink of the lanterns had died away, Mole and Rat kicked the fire up, drew their chairs in, brewed themselves a last nightcap of mulled ale, and discussed the events of the long day. At last, the rat, with a tremendous yawn, said, "Mole, old chap, I'm ready to drop. Sleepy is simply not the word. That your own bunk over on that side? Very well, then, I'll take this. What a ripping little house this is. Everything so handy." He clambered into his bunk and rolled himself well up in the blankets, and slumber gathered him forthwith, as a swath of barley is folded into the arms of the reaping machine. The weary Mole also was glad to turn in without delay, and soon had his head on his pillow in great joy and contentment. But ere he closed his eyes, he let them wander round his old room, mellow in the glow of the firelight that played or rested on familiar and friendly things which had long been unconsciously a part of him, and now smilingly received him back without rancor. He was now in just the frame of mind that the tactful rat had quietly worked to bring about in him. He saw clearly how plain and simple, how narrow even, it all was, but clearly, too, how much it all meant to him, and the special value of some such anchorage in one's existence. He did not at all want to abandon the new life and its splendid spaces, to turn his back on sun and air and all they offered him and creep home and stay there. The upper world was all too strong. It called to him still, even down there, and he knew he must return to the larger stage. But it was good to think he had this to come back to, this place which was all his own, these things which were so glad to see him again, and could always be counted upon for the same simple welcome. And that's the end of that chapter. Next is chapter 6, Mr. Toad. But that will be next week, I'm assuming. And excuse me, I think I've got a hair in the back of my throat. Anyway, so with that, I want to thank everybody for joining me. It was a great pleasure, as always, to have your company, albeit virtually, but it's still there. This is the modern world, and virtual is pretty darn good. Anyway, so I will be back next week, same time, same Tad channel, same reading matter, because I'm going to finish The Wind in the Willows before I do anything else, but we're only maybe like a third of the way into the book. Yeah, so we've got plenty to go. Until that point, until I see you again and can share time with you, please take very good care of yourselves. Take good care of your loved ones, your friends and neighbors, and keep an eye out for anybody who might need some help, even if it's just a friendly smile. And I will talk to you very soon. So peace, be well. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you very soon. Ciao, bambini.